The first time you hear the drums, you think it is only your heartbeat, but the sound does not fade. It grows, and with each strike, a piece of yourself is carved away. Sergeant Braun Hesk had carried the Emperor's wars in his bones for 23 years. His back was bent with the weight of mud-caked trenches, of screaming men, of 1,000 forgotten campaigns where victory meant little more than holding one more line of poisoned earth. He had long since forgotten the warmth of his mother's face, the smell of her bread pulled from an oven, the voice of his father calling him to rest. Those memories had been scoured from him as surely as a lasbolt scours flesh from bone. What remained was the rhythm of duty. Wait, drill. Clean the weapon. March. Kill. Repeat. Yet, on Carthax too, during the third month of Operation Righteous Cleansing, something changed at dawn. The sky burned red, painted with the blood of a sun filtered through smoke and endless artillery haze. The trenches smelled of cordite, rotting rations, and sour stench of decay. Rats skittered between boots, bold enough to chew on the corpses left half buried in the mud walls. Men stirred awake, not because they had slept, but because habit demanded they rise. And Hesk, as always, reached for his lost pistol. It was a battered thing, its grip worn smooth by decades of service. The power cell housing was cracked, patched with resin and wire by tech adepts who had never expected it to last this long. But it did. Each morning, he checked it with ritual precision, the click of the chamber, the faint hum of its power core, the familiar weight in his hand. He checked it as he had for years because ritual was the only way to hold back the madness that morning. Though, when he closed his eyes, he heard something else. A beat deep, primal, relentless. Thumb. Thumb at first, he thought it was. The rush of blood in his temples, the pulse of his own weary heart, bracing for another charge into no man's land. But the sound did not fade. It did not sink with his breath. It rose beneath the thunder of distant artillery and the sharp crack of less fire. It seeped up through the earth like something buried. Alive and furious, the drums. They called to him, though he could not say how. Some of his men prayed in the mornings. Young Cain clutched a bent aqua charm, muttering half-remembered catechisms. Marcus counted grenades as though each was a bead on some unholy rosary. Vex polished the trigger of his weapon until the metal shone. Men anchored themselves however they could, and Hesk had always anchored himself with silence. But on that morning, silence was broken by rhythm. The paradox was cruel. A guardsman was taught to fear death, to fear the heretic's blade, the alien's claw, the witch's curse. But Hesk discovered something worse. To survive was not always to be saved. Sometimes survival was the first step toward damnation. The drums promised endurance. They promised strength. Each beat made his grip steadier, his heart lighter, his muscles taut with energy he had not felt in years. But strength has a price. It is never freely given, and as the rhythm pulsed in his ears, Hesk realized that pieces of himself, small, fragments at first, were slipping away, memories dulled. Mercy weakened. The world narrowed to sound and blood. He looked at his pistol and remembered when he had once carved tally marks on its side to honor the fallen under his command. The names had mattered then. Each death was a scar. But those tallies blurred. Now, their meaning washed away in the beat of invisible drums. He shook his head. Tried to focus on the lieutenant's orders, the squad's murmured banter, the crunch of boots in frozen muck. Yet beneath it, all the drums continued, insistent, as though they had always been there, waiting for him to finally hear, corruption never begins with choice. It begins with a sound you cannot silence. It begins with the lie that strength is mercy. That endurance is survival. That blood is just another duty. And for Braun Hesk, the lie came wrapped in the rhythm of war, in the pulse that sounded like his own heart. By the time he understood it was something else entirely. It was already too late. The drums had already carved their mark into him, and they would never stop. Some say the Emperor listens to prayers. Others say Khorne listens to screams. In the galaxy of the 41st millennium, every world is steeped in blood. Some of it is shed in the shadows of hive cities, where starving workers slit each other's throats for moldy rations. Some spills across nameless moons, where Imperial guard regiments are thrown against alien hosts like sand into a storm. And some pours from the great wars that engulf entire sectors. Rivers of crimson staining the soil so deeply that no crop will ever grow again. This is the truth no commander dares to speak aloud. War is not an aberration in the Imperium. It is. Its heartbeat, and there are powers that thrive upon it. The Khorne, the blood god, does not whisper promises of forbidden knowledge or eternal pleasures. He is not subtle. His creed is simple, brutal, and eternal. Rage is worship. Murder is prayer. Every death, every duel, every battle is an offering. Where his name is spoken, it is usually in curses spat between volleys of gunfire. Where his name is prayed, it is with bloodied lips and broken teeth. To speak of Khorne openly is to risk the noose of the commissar. But soldiers know. They know. In the marrow of their bones, even if they never dare admit it, every war they fight, every drop of blood spilled, feeds not only the Emperor's empire, but the throne of skulls beyond mortal sight. The paradox is cruel. The Imperium condemns the worship of chaos, yet the Imperium wages wars without end, and war is Khorne's dominion. Each victory, claimed in the name of the Emperor, echoes in the skull pits of the blood god in the trenches of Carthax too. Men muttered such things in hushed tones. When they thought the Vox units could not carry their words, they say the Emperor listens to prayers. Aye, but Khorne listens to screams. The words carried the weight of half belief, half jest, but the fear behind them was real. Because everyone in those trenches had screamed. Everyone had seen friends gutted by bayonets or torn apart by artillery blasts. Everyone had drowned in the chorus of agony that rose nightly from the field hospitals. If such sounds fed a god, then Khorne's feast was endless. Life in the trenches was a ritual of futility. Soldiers scraped rust from his bayonet with a whetstone dulled from overuse, even though he knew the blade would bend or snap in the first clash of close quarters. Another bent over parchment, writing a letter to a mother who would never receive it. For no courier could cross no man's land alive. Some clutched tokens of faith, bronze aquilas rubbed smooth by nervous fingers. Others carved charms of bone, muttering half-superstitions that belonged less to the creed of the ecclesiarchy, and more to the half-remembered myths of chaos. Day after day, the same. Dig deeper trenches. Stack sandbags against the inevitable barrage. Count rations. Count ammunition. Count bodies. And wait for the next order that would hurl them into slaughter. What is war, if not the slow bleeding out of hope? The truth is that few guardsmen expected to survive their campaigns. They count days, not futures. The promise of imperial righteousness, of fighting for the light of the Emperor, dulled quickly when one's boots rotted from standing in corpse's filth, and one's lungs blackened from breathing endless smoke. Men fought not because they believed, but because they feared. The commissar's bolt pistol more than the enemy's blade, and yet, in this cycle of despair, corruption did not come with horns or fire. It began with a whisper, a sound that seemed like one's own pulse, a thought that seemed like one's own rage. Every act of war was a prayer. The soldiers did not know it, but every lasbolt fired, every bayonet thrust, every fist swung in fury was an offering, not to the Emperor, whose silence was eternal, but to something else, something that answered. On Carthax too, the soldiers of the 47th Cadian Shock fought as they had been taught, by the book, by the lash, by the grinding inevitability of attrition. But among them was a man who would hear more than orders, more than gunfire, more than his own breath. Sergeant Braun Hesk, a veteran who had survived more campaigns than his officers had seen years. A man whose body was mapped with scars that told stories no archive recorded. He bore them as others bore medals, marks of survival, of endurance. He carried with him a battered last pistol that had saved him more times than he cared to count. And a silence deeper than any trench, but silence cannot protect a man forever. because beneath the silence, beneath the thunder of artillery, beneath even the prayers of dying men, there was a rhythm. It waited. It called. And when Hesk began to hear it, his life and the lives of his squad would twist into something far worse than death. Faith claims the Emperor is eternal, but so too is blood, and blood always finds its god. Every fortress crumbles not from the assault of cannons, but from the cracks no one sees forming within its walls. Sergeant Bron Hesk had survived what should have killed him a dozen times over. His men trusted him because he was still alive, and because somehow they were still alive beside him. That was the simple measure of leadership in the Guard, not glory, not honor, but the ability to drag the squad one more day into a war that would never end. They knew his scars, though few dared to ask their stories. A jagged line down his left shoulder where an orc cleaver had nearly taken the arm. A puckered burn along his temple where shrapnel had kissed bone. But the deeper wounds were the ones that never showed. Those lay behind his eyes, in the way he stared too long into the horizon, as if expecting it to stare back. His armor was as battered as the man himself. The ceramite plates were cracked, repaired with riveted patches, and scraps scavenged from. The dead, each dent was a memory. Each scar upon the plating was a ghost dot at night. In those few hours when the guns quieted enough to allow men to pretend at sleep, Hesk performed the same ritual. He drew out his last pistol, the weapon older than some of his troopers, and rubbed a thin sheen of oil into its grip. His hands moved with mechanical precision, a litany repeated so often it had become prayer. The weapon hummed faintly, its cell chamber flickering with tired light. To the squad, this ritual was reassurance. If the sergeant was still tending his weapon, then tomorrow would still come. But there was another ritual. One Hesk kept hidden. From the pocket of his flak coat he would draw a small tin locket. Its hinge was rusted, its surface dented by years of mud and impacts, but it still opened. Inside were two faces, blurred and fading, a woman and a child. Once, he had traced those faces every night before battle, whispering their names. Now, he stared at them in silence, unable to recall the sound of their voices. The features grew dimmer with each passing campaign. Like ink dissolving in water. He closed the locket with a snap and tucked it away, always with a frown. The men never saw. They thought their sergeant uncheckable. But the cracks were there. It began with the drums. At first, they came only in the moment before battle, when orders were shouted, when the earth shook with artillery, when fire crackled across the horizon. A low, steady rhythm beneath the noise. A heartbeat that did not belong to him. Thump, thump, thump. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was the rush of blood, the madness of anticipation before the charge. Yet it persisted even in silence, even in sleep. The rhythm became a shadow in his mind, walking with him, eating with him, waiting for him. The others could not hear it. He asked once, half in jest, half in fear, "Do you hear that?" "Just the gun, Sergeant," Marcus replied, glancing up with puzzled eyes. "Just the rats," said Vex, tightening a grenade strap across his chest. Young Kane only shook his head. His fingers clutched his aquila charm so tightly that the edges cut his palm. Hesk did not ask again. Some truths must be buried, even when they begin to bloom inside the skull. The squad trusted him. Still, they followed his orders without hesitation. In their eyes, he was the wall that held back the tide. But even trust can wither when the foundation. Against a rot dot during one patrol, when the trench collapsed under bombardment and the squad scrambled for cover, they saw him pause in the open. For a moment too long, he stood still, shoulders straight, as if listening to something no one else could. The shells burst around him, showering mud and metal, but he did not flinch. Only when Vex dragged him down into the crater did he move. And even that his face was calm, almost serene. The men whispered about it that night. Not openly, not yet. But whispers grow like cracks in stone. Loyalty is built on belief. And belief shatters when silence turns to whispers no one else can hear. The night before the next assault, Hesk sat with his squad, as always. He checked his last pistol. He listened to their small talk, their half-jokes, their muttered prayers. He even smiled at Kane's nervous questions, though he no longer heard the words. The drums were louder now, steady beneath every sentence. They rose and fell with his breath, as if they had always been part of him, waiting to be noticed. When the order came, another charge across no man's land, another suicide mission, masked as duty, Hesk stood. He slipped the locket back into his pocket. For the first time, he did not open it. The faces inside were gone to him. The only face that mattered now was the faceless one that waited in rhythm. His men gathered their weapons. They adjusted straps, checked charge packs, whispered prayers. And Braun Hesk marched to the drums. Only he could hear. Power rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives quietly, in the shiver of strength where weakness once was, in laughter where silence should reign. The campaign did not relent. Days blurred into nights of endless assault, each dawn beginning with the shriek of artillery and each dusk ending with the tally of the dead. The squad no longer questioned orders. They simply moved when told, fired when commanded, and dug graves when time permitted. Yet something had changed among them. Not in their routines, but in their sergeant. Braun Hesk fought with a vigor none of them had seen before, where once he had carried his years like stones upon his shoulders. Now he moved as if unburdened. His strikes came faster, sharper, crueler. His pistol never missed, his blade never faltered. It was as though some unseen hand steadied him, whispering guidance in the rhythm of war. At first, his men took it for providence. "The Emperor protects," Marcus muttered, awed, after watching Hesk cut down 3 heretics in as many breaths. Kane, clutching his Aquila, whispered that perhaps their sergeant was touched by the divine. But as the fighting grew bloodier, awe turned into unease. Because Hesk no longer fought like a man defending his squad. He fought like a predator unleashed. In one clash amid the ruins of a manufactorum, Hesk drove forward alone. His men struggled to keep pace as he carved through enemies with unnatural speed. He laughed as he killed, a sound so raw, so jubilant, that even his enemies faltered in horror. He disarmed a cultist with a flick of the wrist, split another's skull in a single blow, then turned and fired his last pistol without looking, dropping a foe who had tried to flee. The laughter startled even him. It burst unbidden from his throat, harsh and triumphant, echoing across the broken walls. For the first time in years he felt alive. Every strike seemed to feed him, every death a release. When the last cultist fell, the squad found him standing. In the carnage, chest heaving, blade dripping crimson. His grin lingered too long. His men watched in silence, their breaths caught between reverence and dread. Violence is worship. And worship always demands more. That night, when they returned to the trenches, the men tore open ration bars. They chewed the chalky bricks with mechanical resignation, the taste of dust and ash clinging to their teeth. But Hesk could not eat. He unwrapped the bar, stared at it, then set it aside. The smell of compressed starch turned his stomach. What stirred him instead was the iron tang that lingered in the air. The memory of blood sprayed across his face. The copper taste still on his tongue. His stomach growled, but not for food. His men noticed. They did not comment, but their glances betrayed them. Kane crossed himself 3 times as though to ward away a shadow. Marcus chewed faster, eyes darting to Hesk and away again. Even Vex, hardened by years of brutality, spat his ration onto the mud with a curse. Muttering that something was wrong, Hesk remained silent, his gaze fixed on the battlefield's distant fires. Later, in the darkness of the dugout, he withdrew the tin locket. The faces inside had blurred beyond recognition. Once, they had anchored, reminders of a world beyond war, of love beyond slaughter. Now they were strangers, shadows of shadows. He tried to recall their names. None came. He tried to hear their voices. Only the drums answered. With a snap, he shut the locket and slid it into his pocket. The act was final. He no longer carried the memory. He carried only the rhythm, The Imperium demands obedience. Chaos demands surrender. Both devour. The difference is that Chaos does not lie about it. The squad's trust began to erode. They still marched at his side, still followed his orders. But each man carried the same fear in his eyes. They had seen him fight beyond reason, had heard the laughter that should not have been there. Trust cracked beneath suspicion. During one patrol, when a shell burst near their trench, they saw him rise into the open, unflinching, face lifted, as though greeting the blast. The shrapnel cut the air, yet none struck him. For a moment he seemed untouchable, invincible. And when he turned back, his grin widened at their horror. The silence that followed was heavier than the guns. That night, Cain whispered into the dark, "He isn't the same." The words lingered. Like poison. The others hushed him, but the fear could not be silenced, for they all knew. Their sergeant marched to a beat they could not hear, and it was growing louder. At first he thought the drums were his own heartbeat. Then he understood. His heart did not beat at all. It was beaten for him by something vast, unseen, eternal. The next assault came at dawn. Though dawn was a lie on Carthax too, the sun was little more than a dull red smear in the smog-choked sky, and the air was heavy with the stench of rotting carrion. The 47th were ordered forward once more, thrown into a meat grinder that no strategy could justify. To the command staff, it was another line in a ledger. To the men in the trenches, it was the slow unraveling of their last fragments of sanity. Hesk led his squad as always. His voice was steady, his eyes sharp, his movements precise. But inside, the drums were no longer whispers. They were thunder. They rolled beneath every word, every footstep, every breath. Thumb, thumb, come. The rhythm drowned out the bark of less guns. The shriek of artillery, the wailing of the dying. It was no longer background. It was foundation. A beat that shaped his very body, his very will. When he raised his weapon, the trigger pulled itself. When he swung his blade, the drums guided the arc. And the killing was easy. Heretics fell before him like wheat before the scythe. His pistol shots struck eyes, throats, hearts, as if guided by unseen hands. His blade carved through armor as though it were parchment. His men watched in awe, then in unease, as their sergeant laughed with each cut, each strike. The laughter was not forced, not hysterical. It was pure, unbridled, joyous in the storm of battle. Bronn Hesk understood the truth. The drums were not his heartbeat. They were not the echo of artillery, nor the ringing in his ears. They were music. The music of Khorne, the blood god, the Lord of Skulls, whose symphony is slaughter, whose hymn is death. When the battle ended, silence fell across the ruins. The heretics were dead, their bodies strewn like broken dolls. The squad gathered themselves, trembling, muttering thanks to the Emperor for survival, but Hesk did not pray. He stood in the center of the carnage, chest heaving, hands dripping crimson. He looked down at the corpses at his feet and felt no duty, no guilt, no righteous satisfaction. He felt hunger, a deep consuming hunger that no ration bar, no water, flask, no sermon could ever sat. And then he laughed again, quietly, to himself, because he finally understood he was not killing for the Emperor. He had never been. Every bolt, every blade, every scream had been a prayer to the wrong throne. Khorne had been listening all along that night. Back in the trench, Hesk sat apart from his men. He drew out the tin locket, opened it, and stared. Into its rusted heart, the faces were still there, the woman, the child, but they were strangers now. Their features blurred into nothing, their eyes blank, their names lost. He searched his mind for them, clawed at the recesses of memory where they should have been, and found only silence. The locket that had once anchored him, that had tied him to a life beyond war, was now meaningless. A relic of someone who no longer existed. He closed it with a snap, not in sorrow, but in finality. The man who had carried it was gone. The sergeant his men had followed was gone. What remained was something else, something born of drums and blood. Death would have been. Mercy? Living on and surrendering everything that once made him human. The proof came days later, during a raid on a captured bunker. The squad stumbled upon prisoners, heretics taken alive by another regiment. They were half-starved, beaten, bound, in chains, awaiting transport for interrogation. The sight of them stirred no pity in Hesk, no duty to deliver them to command, no thought of justice, only the hunger. Before his men could react, Hesk drew his blade. The first captive's head rolled into the mud before a word could be spoken. The second shrieked, the third pleaded, the fourth tried to crawl away on broken legs. Hesk did not hear them. He only heard the drums, louder now, driving his hands, his arms, his voice. He roared as he cut, as though the act was liberation. His squad froze in horror. Marcus reached for his weapon, then stopped, paralyzed by disbelief. Cain wept openly, clutching his aquila until his hands bled. Vex muttered prayers that tangled into nonsense. None moved to intervene. When it was done, the bunker floor was a charnel house. Hess stood over the bodies, breathing hard, his eyes wild, his smile serene. His men stared at him, not as their sergeant, but as something other. Something no longer theirs. Loyalty dies when the leader becomes the monster. In the days that followed, whispers spread through the squad like disease. They obeyed Hesk's orders, but their eyes betrayed them. No longer trust, but fear. No longer comradeship, but suspicion. And beneath it all, the unspoken truth. Their sergeant was gone. Only the drums remained. There is mercy in death. But corruption is a life that never ends. A hunger that devours everything you once were and leaves only the craving behind. Braun Hesk no longer marched as a man. He moved like a predator, each step perfectly in rhythm, with the drums that beat louder with every passing day. The war around him did not weaken him. It fed him. At first, his men had thought him blessed. He fought beyond human endurance. While others stumbled, choking on ash and exhaustion, Hesk strode unbroken. Lasbolts found their marks. Blades shattered against his guard, and when he struck back, it was with an unholy certainty. His laughter carried across the battlefield, terrible in its joy. The blessing became curse, and curse became fear. The squad began to realize the truth during a night raid. They had been ordered to purge a village suspected of harboring heretics. The squad expected resistance. Instead, they found little more than frightened civilians, gaunt women, starving children, old men too weak to lift weapons. The squad hesitated. Even soldiers hardened by endless campaigns could see the futility of this slaughter. Marcus muttered a protest. Cain clutched his aquila and whispered a prayer, but Hesk did not hesitate. He strode into the huts, blade in hand, and began the massacre. His men followed not from duty, but from terror, dragged forward by his shadow. The screams echoed through the night, mingling with his laughter. He killed with abandon, each strike not merely efficient, but indulgent. He lingered in the act, as though savoring it. The others watched, sickened, until they realized they had no choice but to participate, or to risk being turned upon themselves. By dawn, the village was ash. The bodies lay piled in the streets, the dirt stained black with drying blood. The men sat in silence. Their ration bars turned to chalk in their mouths, but even hunger could not force them to eat. Only Cain still tried to cling to faith. He clutched his prayer token. A crude bronze aquila hung from a thin chain, and whispered broken liturgies into the smoke. His hands shook, his voice cracked, but he prayed. That night, the chain snapped. The token fell into the mud, swallowed by filth. Cain clawed at the ground to find it, but the token was gone. His faith had slipped from him as surely as his grip. He wept in silence, staring at his bloodied hands. Hesk only watched. There was no pity in his eyes, only hunger. The corruption was no longer hidden. It was carved into his very flesh. His scars, once dull and pale, seemed red again, as though fresh. His eyes gleamed in the dark, catching firelight with a predator's glint. He did not speak often, but when he did, his voice carried a resonance that chilled even hardened veterans. His men no longer spoke of him as their sergeant. They whispered of him as something else, something inhuman. The Emperor's light is gone from him, Marcus murmured once when he thought Hesk was out of earshot. But Hesk heard. He always heard. He did not punish Marcus for the words. He did not need to. The fear in Marcus's eyes was punishment enough. The Imperium teaches that survival is duty. Chaos teaches that survival is surrender. In the end, both are chains. One gilded, one bloodstained. The squad began to dwindle. Some were lost in skirmishes, abandoned when Hesk pressed forward into slaughter while others fell behind. Some deserted, vanishing into the ruins, preferring the mercy of enemy blades to the horror of following their sergeant any further. Those who remained did so only because fear chained them tighter than loyalty ever had. They no longer marched behind a man. They marched behind a shadow, a beast wearing human skin. A vessel for something they could not name but dared not deny. In one battle, they watched him take on a dozen enemies alone. His blade rose and fell in an endless rhythm. Every strike. Precise, every cut fatal. His body was a storm, his laughter the thunder. When it ended, he stood drenched in gore, surrounded by corpses piled like offerings. His men stood at a distance, weapons lowered, unable to step closer. They no longer followed him into battle. They followed behind, watching the path he carved, praying they would not be caught in a wake. Cain was the last to hold on to him. Even as the others faltered, Cain whispered prayers at night, clutching the broken chain of his lost Aquila as though the absence itself might still save him, but faith cannot mend what has already been given away. One night, as Cain whispered into the smoke, Hesk turned his gaze upon him. For a moment, their eyes met, soldier and sergeant, man and monster. Cain's lips trembled with prayer, but the words died. He looked into his sergeant's face and saw nothing human reflected there. He saw only the drums. Death ends suffering. Corruption ensures it never ends. By the time the campaign ended, there was no squad left to follow him. Some had deserted, some had fallen, some had broken. All that remained was Bronn Hesk, walking alone through the ruins, his footsteps in rhythm. With the endless beat, the sergeant was gone. The man was gone. Only the hunger remained. Death is silence. Corruption is silent without end. When the guns finally quieted on Carthax II, the battlefield was not a place of victory. It was a graveyard without headstones, a wasteland where the wind dragged the smell of blood across broken trenches and shattered walls. The bodies of guardsmen, heretics, and civilians lay together in heaps that no tallykeeper could separate. War had erased their differences, leaving only the universal truth of death. Among the mud and ash, half buried in the trampled earth, lay a tin locket. Its glass was cracked, its hinge broken, its images smeared into unrecognizable shadows. It had been carried once in a pocket, clutched as a memory of a life before war. Now it was only another piece of debris, indistinguishable from bullet casings and snapped chains. No hand reached for it. No eye recognized it. The man who had carried it was gone. Bronn Hesk no longer walked as a sergeant of the Imperial Guard. He no longer walked as a man. He moved through the battlefield with calm certainty, each step guided by a rhythm no one else could hear. Where others staggered under the weight of grief and exhaustion, he strode as though the war itself carried him forward. The squad that had once followed him was gone. Some buried in shallow graves, some vanished into the smoke, some broken in spirit long before their bodies failed. Their names were whispers lost on the wind, unheard by the Emperor, unheard by their comrades. Hesk did not call them. He did not remember them. He remembered only the drums. Thumb, thumb, thumb. Once he had mistaken them for his own heartbeat. Once he had believed they were fear or adrenaline. Now he knew better. His heart had been taken, replaced. What beat within him was not life, but a hymn, the endless hymn of Khorne, the blood god, whose throne is built not of marble or gold, but of skulls piled higher than mountains. The Imperium promises salvation and death. Chaos promises eternity and slaughter. Neither offer mercy. Both are lies dressed as truth. On worlds like Carthax II, men had prayed for survival. They had clung to scraps of faith, tokens of devotion, words of courage muttered into the smoke. And yet, survival was the cruelest fate of all. For every man who died in the mud was spared what Hesk had become, a survivor without humanity. A living vessel for something greater and infinitely hungrier. The Imperial Creed teaches that to die nameless in service is the highest honor. But what of those who survive? What of those who return home stripped of memory, stripped of self, carrying inside them the echo of drums that never stop? Is that still survival? Or is it damnation extended across every waking breath? The truth is this: war never ends in the 41st millennium. The Imperium cannot stop fighting. It does not know how. Its wars consume worlds, generations, entire civilizations, and still the machine grinds forward. Each campaign is justified as righteous, as necessary, as holy. But beneath the banners, beneath the prayers, beneath the reports, filed to faceless bureaucrats, each war is an offering. Every lasbolt fired is a prayer to Khorne. Every scream torn from a dying throat is a hymn. Every drop of blood spilled on nameless soil is an offering poured into his chalice. The Imperium claims to fight against the gods of chaos. But, in truth, it serves them with every breath of its endless wars. And none feast more than the blood. God. Death ends the heartbeat. Corruption replaces it with drums that never stop. Imagine, then, the fate of men like Bronn Hesk, men who survive too long, who fight too much, who carry scars deeper than flesh. They march forward, battle after battle, campaign after campaign, until what remains of them is no longer a soldier, no longer a human being, but only hunger in human shape. They do not die. They endure. And endurance is the cruelest gift of all. What is worse than death? Not the silence of the grave. Not the nameless body left to rot in a trench. What is worse than death is to live on when everything human within you has already perished. To walk with your comrade's blood on your hands, and to laugh while spilling more. To hold a locket of faces you can no longer name. To feel your heart beating in rhythm to drums you cannot silence. In the end, Bronn Hesk's fate is not unique. His story is a mirror held to every soldier in the Imperium. For whether they know it or not, whether they admit it or deny it, each war they fight feeds the gods who will one day claim them. Some are claimed in an instant, torn apart on the field. Others are claimed slowly, piece by piece, until they no longer recognize themselves in the mirror. This is the grim truth of the galaxy. To die is to be forgotten. To live is to become something unrecognizable. The battlefield on Carthax II lies silent now. The corpses rot. The banners are torn. The locket lies shattered in the mud, its faces erased forever. But somewhere, beyond the veil of mortal sight, the drums still beat. They beat for every war that was, and every war that will be. They beat for every soldier who prays to the Emperor while unknowingly offering their soul to Khorne. They beat for every survivor who carries not a heartbeat, but a hymn. Which fate is worse, to die nameless in the mud, or to live forever as something no longer your own?